Welcome back to the channel. It's from the Park One. We showcase amateur athletes every day. Today we're talking about the top AP Poll 25 football scores on yesterday. First game was Auburn versus Oklahoma, with Oklahoma becoming victorious behind the arm of John Mator, who was 24 for 36, 271 yards and one touchdown. And he had a great game by Isaiah Satinga III, who had 9 receptions, 127 yards, and one touchdown. Our second game we're looking at is Purdue versus Notre Dame, where Notre Dame was victorious 56 to 30 behind the arm of C.J. Carr, who was 10 for 12 for 223 yards and two touchdowns. And he had a good game by Jeremiah Love, who had 19 carries for 157 yards and two touchdowns. The next game we're going to talk about is South Carolina versus Missouri, with Missouri winning 29 to 20 behind the arm of Bo Probulo, who was 16 for 27 with 171 yards, one touchdown, and one interception. And on the ground, he had a good game with Ahmad Hardy, who had 22 carries, 138 yards, and one touchdown. The next game was USC versus Michigan State, with USC winning behind the arm of Jaden Movavi, who was 20 for 26 for 235 yards and three touchdowns. And he had a great game by Micaiah Lemon, who had 8 receptions for over 100 yards and one touchdown. The next game was Michigan versus Nebraska, with Michigan winning 30 to 27 behind a great running attack. First of all, they had Justin Hayes, who had 7 rushes for 149 yards and one touchdown, and his counterpart, Jordan Marshall, who had 6 rushes for 80 yards. Florida State beat Kent State 66 to 10 behind Gavin Sawchuk, who had 11 rushes for 97 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he was aided on the ground by Samuel Singleton Jr., who had 10 rushes for 86 yards and 2 touchdowns. Next up, Tulane versus Ole Miss. Ole Miss became victorious with the score of 45 to 10 behind Trinidad Chamberlain, who was 17 for 27 for 307 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he was a dual threat. He had 14 carries for 112 yards. And he had a great wide receiver, Deuce Alexander, who had 4 receptions for 94 yards and 1 touchdown. Next up is Oregon versus Oregon State. Oregon pitched a shutout, 41 to nothing, behind the arm of Dante Moore, who was 21 for 35 for 305 yards and 4 touchdowns. And he was aided by Gary Bryan Jr., who had 3 receptions for 65 yards and 1 touchdown. Next up, it was Sam Houston versus Texas. Finally, Arch Manning had a great game. He was 18 for 21 for 309 yards and 3 touchdowns. And he had a great running attack led by Christian Clark, who had 13 carries for 62 yards and 1 touchdown. The next game was Vanderbilt versus Georgia State. Vanderbilt opened up a can, winning 70 to 21 behind Diego Daisy, who was 18 for 24 for 245 yards and 1 touchdown. And he had a great game for Macaulay Young, who had 2 carries for 64 yards and 1 touchdown. And next up was Texas Tech, who beat Utah 34 to 10 behind the arm of Will Howard, who was 13 for 16 for 169 yards and 2 touchdowns. And on the ground, he had a great day by Cameron Dickey, who had 13 carries for 67 yards and 2 touchdowns. And last but not least, Indiana beat Illinois 63 to 10 behind Fernando Mendoza, who was 21 for 23 for 267 yards and 5 touchdowns. And he was aided on the ground by Kobe Martin, who had 12 rushes for over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. And last but not least, the LSU Tigers won 56-10, beat Southeastern behind the arm of Garrett Nussmeier, who was 25 for 31 for 273 yards and 3 touchdowns, and Juwan Johnson, who had 8 carries for 43 yards and 2 touchdowns. For all your amateur news, subscribe to Formula Park 1 on YouTube. Thank you for your support.